the conflict that we are seeing. We are already seeing on the ground, reports are coming in about this taking a religious turn as well.
Sure.
And that is a ticking bomb.
It took 1 month for the Home Minister to visit Manipur after the violence broke out.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister never went. There has been a lot of criticism against this. If Prime Minister could hold podcast.
आपके साथ पॉडकास्ट करने का मूड हो रहा है सर।
अरे वाह मोदी जी आप एक बार आके मणिपुर में विजिट कर लीजिए।
Manipur are watching you. So when you speak in the parliament, speak in one voice.
Yes.
True.
What was concerning was the government even tried preventing opposition leaders from entering the state.
Rahul Gandhi's convoy was stopped by the Manipur police.
Look at how European Union passed statements on this crisis as if it was just a communal issue.
Yes. Who is at fault? Is it the Kukis or the Meiteis? Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A beautiful Indian state, Manipur, is on boil. Killings, arson, and a brazen erosion of the rule of law. The government, both the central government and the state government, has miserably failed to control the situation to restore normalcy in the state. What is happening in Manipur is worrisome, it is agonizing. And we at Unacademy apologize to the people of Manipur for the crisis that they are in. We sympathize with those who lost their lives and their loved ones. To understand the conflict in Manipur, we need to understand the history of this conflict. What is the conflict between the three communities who dominate the state of Manipur? The Kukis, the Meiteis, and the Nagas. To understand the history behind it, joining us today on this podcast is our history expert, Abhishek sir. Is Manipur a prisoner of its geography? And has geography got something to do with the conflict that the state is in? For that, we have the geography expert, Mukesh sir, joining us. And this crisis in Manipur also has an international dimension. What is the role of Myanmar in this conflict? Why is a state such as Mizoram sympathetic to Myanmar? And why is the state government in Manipur calling for a ban on the free movement regime in Manipur? It also has a grave implication on India's internal security challenges. To understand the international relations dimension and the internal security challenges that we are facing in Manipur is our international relations and internal security expert, Chetan sir. Appreciate all of you for joining us today. Let me start with you, Abhishek sir. Are Kukis the original inhabitants of Manipur? Or are Meiteis the original inhabitants? What is the conflict between Kukis and Meiteis? What is the role of Nagas? Who is an insider? Who is an outsider? What is this conflict? Can you simplify this for our audience?
Sir, the conflict itself, if you look at the rhetoric which is coming out in different literature or in different aspects and sources, it seems that there's a very strong historical background to this conflict itself. Now, there are three basic dimensions here. First is, where has Manipur been geographically over the period of time? Second is the Kuki and Meitei identity. And the third aspect is the concept of old and new Kuki. So the first aspect is that Manipur as a state was independent, ruled by Meitei kings, that is very well established. And Kuki as a category, as we know it today, for the first time we see it in colonial historiography in 1777 when Hastings sends a message to the British that I need some assistance against Kuki raids itself.
On the 10th of December, 7 p.m. onwards, on Unacademy UPSC Unstoppable's YouTube channel, we are going live to celebrate the 9 years of the success of the Unacademy group. Lots of influencers, your top educators, and lots of surprises in store for you. Do not forget to join us live on the 10th of December, 7 p.m. onwards. Let's crack it.
So the word Kuki has itself seen its genesis in a colonial context. Now, thereafter, Manipur briefly went into
So Kukis were raiding what?
Kukis were raiding the British, you can say, envoys in this sector. The British wanted timber out of this sector. So the communication was that I want assistance, military assistance against these raids which are happening in the Lushai Hill and the Manipur Valley sector. Now, Manipur at that given point of time was under Burmese rule. Thereafter, because Burma had a certain expansionary understanding that will in turn lead to the Anglo-Burmese War, 1820, 50s and 1885. And thereafter, the British will take this sector through the Treaty of Yandabo. Once Assam, Manipur, this whole sector will come to the British, then it becomes Manipur versus the British. And in 1891, we have Anglo-Manipur Wars. And thereafter, there's one more historical event which is very contagious in this concept, which is called the Kuki Uprising of 1917-1919. This is where there's a lot of rhetoric involved that was it an uprising or was it just a disturbance? Wherein the Meitei people are saying it's a disturbance, not a war of independence against the Meiteis. This is the first aspect to this. The second is there are two major understandings here on Kuki identity, and it is very important to understand Manipur through that lens. Colonial historiography says that 1777 the word Kuki comes through. It is a Bengali word which basically is an exogenous word for the people who are not part of the valley itself, Kuki. And thereafter, in the 1881 census for the first time, we see the category of Kuki. But the British, what they did was, they created the category of old and new Kuki. And the idea was there is only 8,000 old Kukis and 17,000 new Kukis. And thereafter, the historiography of the British argues that the old Kuki identity got subsumed within the Naga identity. And therefore, the people who came from the Lushai Hills in turn are called the new Kuki. And that is the whole argument that the Kuki identity is based on immigration. However, if you go into Manipur history and written by the Manipuris themselves, specifically Professor Kabui, he argues this is very problematic. Just to simplify this, to understand it in the most comprehensive way possible, what he argues is that the Kuki-Meitei relationship is very old. From prehistoric times, the argument is Kukis have a certain mythology through which they create their own identity, linked to a certain cave out of which they came through, and then they create the Kuki identity. We have in Buddhism a word called Koki, and it refers to the same people, Kukis. Further, in Meitei history, it is known that two rebellions of the Burmese side and the British side were managed by Meitei kings because of the help of Kuki tribals and Kuki tribal chiefs. So there
was harmony between Meiteis and Kukis.
It was a proper peaceful coexistence vis-a-vis what we see on the ground at that given point of time. Now there are two understandings here, and the whole contestation is over this only. Is the new Kuki identity what is seemed as an immigration-based concept, or is this a later formation of identity over the concept of the ST category in that state itself? So if we understand this, first we have to ascertain valley versus hills is a standard trope in anthropology wherein there is always conflict. But what we see is that the Kuki and the Meitei identity were together. They were known to fight together against the British, against the Burmese. It is only after independence, when the ST category was given to the Kukis, this is where there was an alienation of the Meitei identity, and that in turn led to this larger conflict which we are trying to understand. So history is contested, and this is where we have to first ascertain which is the right one. We can blame the British here for creating a category which on the ground did not exist, which is New Kuki, which is South Hills, Lushai Hills immigrants are called New Kuki. This is where we have to actually understand the nuance of this
Or
concept.
is it true that British brought in Kukis so that they can fight war with the Meiteis?
No. We have enough historical evidence coming out of this sector to say that the Kuki-Meitei relationship is quite old, if not prehistoric. It is pre-colonial for sure.
Or British wanted Kukis to come and act as a buffer with the Burmese?
This is also a very interesting argument which has been pushed in by the historian of Manipur, wherein British were known to balance tribes. And the creation of the Kuki identity in that regard could be also to balance the Meitei identity. So that would be quite unlikely that they create a category of Kuki itself and then bring in people from the Burmese sector. They were original inhabitants of this sector. Meitei identity very well established. Kuki identity is something which is being now, because what the Meiteis argue is that the 1917-1919 uprising was just a small excursion between the British and the Kukis. Whilst the Kukis argue that we were fighting for our independence, the hill was fighting for independence vis-a-vis creating a separate identity itself. This is where the problem is, that because the British wrote a very colored history of this sector, that in turn leads to these categories which we are not able to properly ascertain.
So there is your history, there is my history. So far as the real history is concerned, it doesn't exist.
Sir, this is actually Bernard Cohen, there's a historian. He talks about commodification of culture. This is called the idea that what the British did was, in 1881 through the census, which is a colonial form of knowledge, they created an identity called Kuki. They created an identity called Meitei. Maybe it was subsumed within itself. However, by creating a specific category, they created a certain schism in this identity itself. It's all about identity formation here. Because if we go by mythology of this sector itself.
So you are trying to say is that this community was a homogeneous community. There was no difference between Meiteis and Kukis. That's what
it's not a homogeneous community, because valley culture versus tribal culture in the hills is standardly established, because they have a different type, because it's an agrarian civilization for Meiteis and a more slash and burn and what we call.
So can we say not homogeneous but harmonious?
Harmonious. There is a very well established historical understanding that it was a peaceful coexistence and cooperation between these two communities. That is the irony of this whole story.
So that brings me to the raging topic. When we say that this has always been harmonious, clearly there has been a High Court judgment last year which sort of upended the entire equilibrium. So if you could just throw some light on what this High Court judgment was.
I think it was misunderstood judgment. The way it is being portrayed in the media, it was not the case. So what happened? Kukis are STs. Nagas also have ST status. There are some Meiteis who have SC status, some have OBC status. There was a long pending demand that Meiteis should also be granted the ST status. Matter went to the court, and what court did? Court did not ask or direct the government to give them ST status. Court asked the state government to expeditiously, preferably within 1 month of the receipt of this order, you should consider taking this matter with the central government so that this ST status can be granted to the Meiteis. This was viewed as if the High Court has granted ST status to Meiteis and the state government has to abide by this within 1 month. For that, we need to understand that there is already a Supreme Court judgment, a 5-judge Supreme Court judgment in the year 2000, Milind versus State of Maharashtra, wherein court has categorically stated that no state government, no court, no tribunal can grant ST or SC status to anybody. That's the power with the President of India. So the process is a bill has to be introduced in the parliament, it has to be passed, basis that the President will notify the SC-ST list, SC-ST order. And in that, there will be the list of SCs and STs. So granting ST status cannot be given by the High Court or the state government. That's the job of the center. But unfortunately, it was misunderstood or misinterpreted. Luckily, later, this judgment was taken back by the Manipur High Court. But then the damage was done, because this is considered to be one trigger which led to this crisis between the Meiteis and Kukis.
Yeah.
So that's. Do you think the demand by the Meiteis for the ST status is a valid demand? Because the local committee had laid down a criteria as well, based on primitiveness and backwardness.
Yes.
But Meiteis strictly don't fall under that category. They are in majority and they are known to be politically and economically stronger.
Prosperous
As well.
Yeah.
But that prosperity or numerical majority has got nothing to do with your identity as a tribe. If you are a tribe, you have to be granted that status. That is where in this conflict, unfortunately, nobody is completely wrong and nobody is completely right. So it is sad to see what is happening in Manipur. If you are saying that they were living in harmony, wasn't there, and this is something that you can shed light on, wasn't there a demand for a separate country by the Kukis?
Yes.
The demand for a separate country by the Meiteis. The demand for the separate country by Nagas. In fact, Nagas petitioned the British that the entire Northeast should be declared Nagaland. And it should be a separate independent country. What is the issue with the Seven Sisters, with the Northeast? Why is this area in chaos, in conflict? Remember, Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister when Mizoram was bombed. This was the time when Air Force was used to bomb own citizens. What is the conflict in the Northeast?
If you look at the Northeast region, it is a multi-ethnic society. And the history, the geography, the complex social structure has a big role to play here. Given that there are different tribes, different indigenous communities, which are very guarded about their culture, their language, their land, and their customs as well. This often leads to intertribal, interethnic rivalries. And this has been at the heart of most conflicts in Northeast India. For example, you look at the Mizo conflict, which was primarily Mizo versus Assamese conflict. So you do see some similarities with regard to the Meitei-Kuki conflict or the Kuki-Naga conflict as well. In 90s, Kukis and Nagas were at conflict.
Yes.
So this is something that you see across the region. And also the remoteness of the region, the backwardness, the lack of development, the lack of infrastructure. This has a big role to play. And there is a perception amongst the local tribes and indigenous communities that their demands, their grievances have not been addressed by the government, be it the state or the center. For example, if you look at the Kukis, they have always insisted that their land deserves protection through the land reforms that was introduced, and the ST status which was given to them is valid, and they strongly oppose the ST status to the Meiteis as well. It's not just about protecting their own land, but at the same time they want to ensure that the majority community doesn't get the ST status.
Is it because the Meiteis who dominate the valley will then have access to the land in the tribal areas?
Yes, absolutely. And also, it's not just about the economy of it. Look at the politics of it. The Meiteis have 40 seats in the assembly, whereas there are just 19 seats for both Kukis and Nagas combined.
But that has got to do with the population as well. The population is
Let's
dominated.
put the numbers there. The valley region has, let's say, 50% and above Meiteis. Kukis and Nagas account for 40%. So at least, I mean, you can't have the assembly seats less than half. 40 and 90 is a huge difference when the population is 50 and 40%.
But there isn't the argument that the Meitei population predominantly is in Manipur itself, whereas the Kuki and Naga population, you will find them to be present in Nagaland and
other areas as
Mizoram as well. So that is where the Meitei population has always felt that they require a greater representation because this is the only state.
But eventually within the state, if you look at, let's say, the state government's welfare programs, they have largely been focused on the Imphal Valley itself. The investment of the government, the infrastructure creation, and the hill areas have not really seen that kind of development.
But isn't that the case for the entirety of Northeast? Whatever development that we see, it is a kind of a growth pole model where you have the growth and the development in one city will develop, and the hope is that once that city develops, the development will filter through.
This is where you can see as a similarity with Assam as well.
Yes.
Where Assamese were dominant, few parts of Brahmaputra Valley developed, but the Bodo areas, the Dima Hasao region, these were left behind, and that's where the separatist demands came up.
But isn't this a standard dichotomy between an agrarian civilization and a tribal identity?
So here I would say that geography has got a significant role to play. You have various different geographers who have said, and the entire school of determinism, when we talk about it, that environment around you, the geography around you decides what political course you take, what is the kind of political governance structure that you have. That is something that you will find in the entirety of the region of Northeast, that generally they have favored autonomous form of governance because that has been a tradition going on for centuries altogether. If you take a look at any of the states, let's concentrate on Manipur. If you take a look at the geography of Manipur, it is surrounded by hills from all sides and the valleys in between. So there is always a kind of an invisible siege mentality that despite being in majoritarian population, the Meiteis have always felt that we are under siege. So that is why there has always been a greater amount of care, a greater amount of assuaging for the Meitei interest. But what adds to that insecurity is the fact that the region is densely forested. See, it is a different thing having a valley and tall mountains around yourself. You are secure that this is a natural frontier. But when you have low hills with dense forest and a porous border, there is always the case that we are restricted to the valley, and the Kukis, the Nagas, they keep on coming through and moving out. So they get all the facilities, whereas we are restricted. That siege mentality, whether it is right or wrong, that is a matter for another day. But that is where the geography decides the political discourse, and the geography decides what is the economic reality of that place.
But what is actually interesting is that because of the Meitei location, they have been the royalty and the most politically active sector of that, because Meitei domination over Kuki or the Naga identity was based on the fact that they had agriculture more surplus, and that, so this is where I think this is an interesting aspect of this conflict, that now there's a certain siege mentality which has come
Yes.
through. And previously, that was it was an assertive identity that we are the valley.
But you have to understand this in terms of the resource availability as well. You see, earlier the requirement for that much amount of economic resources was not there. Right? Agrarian economies, they are able to fulfill the requirement of the citizen if the citizen count is less. If the number of people increase in that particular region, there is a problem of overpopulation always. That is when the society starts looking inwards to the divides within the society.
And this is where the role of the government becomes very,
Yes,
very important.
yes.
You should not appear that you are partial
Yes.
towards one community. And this is where I think the state chief minister needs to be dismissed.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
President's rule should be imposed. Now, what has happened is the chief minister is a Meitei himself. And you have 40 MLAs who are from the Meitei community. The Kukis will feel that we are being discriminated against. In fact, the Biren Singh government, they did try something. They started a program called Back to the Hills. So they wanted the government officials to go to hills and assuage the grievances of the people of the hills. But the Kukis think that that Back to Hills campaign was basically targeted at the Nagas. So they wanted to cut favors with Nagas and further isolate Kukis. So this is where, if there is a government which appears to, number one, it is a miserable government in the sense that it has failed to control the situation. Now, it's a government which is also viewed as partisan towards one community. And in a conflict such as this, there is no role for that chief minister. Unfortunately, he has not been dismissed.
Even I would say that not only failed to control, even failed to assess what the level of problem can escalate into. But that brings me
Incompetence.
incompetence.
And forget about incompetence. There is Article 355 there, where under Article 355, it's the duty of the union to ensure that we protect every state from external disturbance and internal disturbance.
yeah.
So the law and order is under the control of the center. So this is not just the failure of the state government, this is the failure of the central government as well. And I think it is because the same political party is in power at the center as well as the state. If it was ruled by an opposition political
I'm
party,
sure
this
that-
government would have been dismissed on day one.
Day one, true.
So what is stopping you from imposing president's rule? Now, you might also argue what will happen because of that. Because
Yeah.
the law and order is still under the control of the center.
There are battalions already deployed.
Exactly. But at least it will give a sense to the
Confidence.
communities that a step has been taken in the right direction. An impartial administration will now be in place. And that is step number one. Then there has to be dialogue. So without dialogue, without reconciliation, apologize to each other.
Yes.
And to-
reconcile.
And to add to this argument, it's not just the failure of the state government, because before the violence started, right, it started in May 2023. Much before that, there were certain controversial steps taken by the state government, the Biren Singh government. For example, they started a drive against encroachment. They started labeling all the Kuki Zo communities in the hill areas as illegal immigrants.
Yes.
Given the crisis in Myanmar and the flow of refugees from there.
The Bangladeshi
And
identity also.
they put a blame that everyone is cultivating drugs, cultivating poppy. Which is a reality as
The
well.
reality
Because
of Manipur is that-
and in fact most of Northeast
Yes.
India, given that it's close to Golden Triangle. there
In
is-
fact, just to interject, now that Manipur is under so much of limelight, there are so many battalions which are deployed. All the smuggling of betel nuts, timber, and everything which was happening from Manipur, that has shifted to Mizoram now.
Mizoram, yeah.
So it is about the conflict which is spreading out. So here I would like to ask you one question. There have been reports that all the arms which have been looted from the region of Manipur, now they are being sold across the border, and people who are being caught at the border, they are being caught with incest rifles.
Yeah.
And there is also a kind of a growing sentiment on the ground that they don't want to see a particular battalion of Indian Army,
Yeah.
like Assam Rifles. They are having some reservation against it, which is unprecedented.
Right.
Indian Army divisions were never faced with this kind of an aspect.
And again, look, this allegation has been from the Meiteis, where they say that Assam Rifles is biased towards the Kukis. And look what the central government does. They bring in CRPF and they have sidelined Assam Rifles.
So you're saying that central government is also favoring Meiteis, one community in this conflict?
It appears as if that is the case.
It's the optics
Because
of
it is the Meiteis who were alleging that Assam Rifles is not neutral. And just based on allegation of one community, the central government decides to bring in a new central armed police force.
So if I try to flip this argument for the argument's sakes, let's suppose a large community in a region of internal disturbance has got reservations that the lawmaker or the protectors, they are not neutral. So as an administrator, shouldn't your role be to bring another set, if you have the reserves, why not bring in certain reserves who are seen to be
that
neutral?
can't be based just on the views of just one community.
And if they're in a majority, what do they need to fare?
Because the argument is that many soldiers from the Assam Rifles, the argument of the Meiteis has been that they have married into the Meitei or the Kuki community, and that is where their interests are not absolutely neutral, which is absolutely absurd.
So the central government succumbing to the pressure by the Meiteis,
Yes.
that speaks volumes about the incompetence.
Incompetence, absolutely,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah, but isn't
agree.
there an angle that this is basically lack of dialogue at all levels also? Meaning there has been no attempt to bring in everybody on the same table.
Crushing by iron hand.
This is where there has been unilateral decisions which have been taken.
So there have been dialogues and all-party meetings,
Yeah.
but unfortunately that has not resulted in something tangible on the ground. Coming to that, what is the role of the free movement regime in this conflict? Mizoram seems to be in favor, Nagas are in favor, but the Meiteis, the Biren Singh government, they are against it. What is that free movement regime? Is that having an impact on this conflict? In what way?
At least that is the perception Meiteis have. Because the free movement regime has been very beneficial for our cultural and economic ties.
But what is that free movement regime?
The free movement regime, it's basically a visa-free travel movement immigration system which has been created so that the tribes which are present on both sides of the border, the communities, they can cross over easily. This applies for 16 kilometers from the border area on both the sides. And these residents of the border villages, be it in Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, they get a free pass essentially. It's a travel document instead of going through the rigid visa process. So the people of these areas, they get a visa-free access. So this helps in border trade. This helps the communities to maintain their cultural familial ties. Because look at Nagas. There are subclans of Nagas present on the other side in Myanmar. Then Kukis have connection with the Zozomi Chin community. Mizos are connected to the Chins. So if you stop this regime just because Meiteis and the state government feels that the entire threat is coming from the outside, you are taking a direct hit on the cultural and economic ties. So no wonder Mizoram, Nagaland they're against it.
But here, let's say that this free movement regime is allowed, which I also feel should be allowed. But we have had evidences earlier as well, where groups like ULFA and all these groups would get the supply of arms through this free movement regime, due to which many of the state governments, they have turned absolutely antagonistic to the idea of free movement regime.
Correct. But when Naga insurgency was going on or Mizo insurgency was going on, the free movement regime was never stopped.
Yes.
Let's say recently as well, NSCN, there is a faction of NSCN which is operating from Myanmar, the Kaplang faction, which still infiltrates, engages in organized crime, carries out attacks as well.
Yeah.
But when these incidents happened, the government did not stop the free movement regime.
But-
Why only?
But when
it happens in
Muiva wanted to come to Manipur pre-accord, at that point of time, you had even the Naga population who was slightly opposing that. But now, in this situation where the condition is so volatile on the ground, do you think keeping that open and porous border, can't it be counterproductive? Because you can have that free border being exploited by people who don't have the
If
best
border
interest?
security is the concern, then step up your patrolling, improve your intelligence gathering.
And in the forested region, the
but-
patrolling becomes very impossible.
Maybe even fence the border or deploy better technology, bring in drones
I'll
and
add in
satellites.
This is where Mizoram is in conflict with. Mizoram says that we don't want fencing. Manipur says that we want fencing.
Bringing
So-
a hard border will always divide the people. And these communities which are divided by these borders, obviously they will have a strong sentiment on this.
That is
the
why-
moment
Chetan sir, something dramatic was communicated by the former Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She said that there is a conspiracy to establish a Christian state in our neighborhood. If I would have allowed it, I would have survived. And then some controversial statement made by the Mizoram Chief Minister as well. What is that issue?
if you look at Northeast insurgencies, there have been few insurgent movements, which is quite interesting. They are ideologically left-aligned, communist inspired, but they have an ideology to establish a Christian state. Look at NSCN, for example. It wants to create a greater Nagaland and it wants it to be a Christian state. Same goes for Kukis, who have a demand for Kuki land, and they envision it as a Christian state. Same was with Mizos. The Mizo insurgent movement envisioned a Mizo land as a Christian land. So somewhere the religious angle does prop in to the insurgent movements as well that we have seen here. Maybe this has to do with, again, the identity. Again, even though it's not communal per se, at least the region which has been influenced by Christian missionaries during the colonial rule, they feel a strong sense that religion plays a role somewhere.
Even
because
after
their
that,
indigenous faiths have been eroded.
quite recently has been as late as as recently as 1990s and early 2000s, there have been evidences of money being funneled to many of these groups via the missionaries.
Right.
So that many of the times raises that preconceived notion that there is a larger.
So is it also happening in Manipur, where the Meiteis are predominantly Hindus,
Yeah.
and the Kukis are predominantly Christians?
Christians.
So is it a tribal, non-tribal conflict or a Hindu-Christian conflict?
It's a
Or
tribal-
is there an international conspiracy, as some would
Sir,
call it?
I don't
Sir,
think so.
before you answer-
That is too far-fetched.
Sir, before
It's
you answer this
it's
question, I'll just say that because we're talking about porous borders, the more we make it a hard border,
Why are we not letting him complete?
no, because it's a very interesting point he will build upon, which is the fact that the more you make it a hard border, the more it will become a communal issue. Because via porous borders, you protect the identity. Once you remove that, you can say, porosity of that border itself, then they will start to look inwards. And this is where Chetan Sir was making a very important point, which is that the communal angle will become more pronounced and the secondary.
No, let me argue once against that.
Right.
To just answer that point,
Yeah.
to begin with, this was an ethnic conflict, a tribal, non-tribal conflict. The communal angle gets added to it. It's more of a political exploitation.
Topping on top of the crisis.
On the crisis,
Yeah.
yes.
Secondary.
Yeah. So here, see the argument with the porous border. Why? Understand that when you have a porous border with a certain number of people always coming in and moving out, a fluidic population, so to say, that always creates mistrust regarding who is the constituent of the state. If you are aware about that these are the groups that I'm living with, these are my co-inhabitants, that still allows for the social trust to build up. So that is the argument, even though I agree that porous border maintains the cultural unity of the region. It ensures that the cultural identity, particularly of the tribal region, and the tribals who are so very well attached to the land, they worship it. So that is very important to ensure that the porosity is maintained.
But you're also looking at it from the internal security
Yes,
perspective.
so that brings another set of problems
That's a
along
very,
with it.
very colonial thing to say. This is where the British always had an anxiety with mobility. And therefore, what happens is that what we are absorbing is this argument that who is my citizen and not my citizen.
True.
For a tribal identity, that is secondary. For them, their individual and mythological understanding, their identity formation is not around nations. It is around culture. And therefore, if we are saying, for the sake of the argument, that fluidity brings in internal security threats, but that's a very Western thing to say. Therefore, anything can be misused. If today we close these borders and we don't allow the cultural identity to foster together, that again creates a new set of issues which will in turn manifest itself in these forms.
And this was
So
exactly
you are exonerating the central and the state government and putting the blame on the
In no way or
British.
form. It is a failure of the administrative mechanism and the administrative machinery to manage this issue. The larger issue here is also historical, identity formation based, but it should have been managed better.
After all, isn't it true that majority of the problems that we face,
Is colonial.
it is colonial?
It is
After
colonial.
all,
But
any
that
part
is
of the
where
country that you look.
we can't just say that the government of India has no role here.
No,
No, we
absolutely.
can't say that the British are the reason because this is happening today.
And then the demand of the Kukis to create a union territory with a legislature, should that demand be met?
Why not? Because there are many instances in Northeast India where such demands have been met.
And let's not forget, Manipur was carved out as a state after an armed insurgency.
Yes. Here I remember a very interesting observation that G.K. Pillai had made, the former Union Secretary.
Home Secretary.
The Home Secretary, yeah. So he pointed out that Nagaland was carved out and given statehood in 1963 based on Naga insurgency and to satisfy the demands of the Nagas. But Manipur becomes a state in 1972. Now, this in a way affected the Meiteis. I'll tell you why. Because Meiteis were concerned about Nagas. Naga insurgency had started from 1947, even before India became independent. Yeah. And when Meiteis saw that Nagas were getting a separate state, and there are Naga-dominated hills in Manipur, they felt a territorial threat because Nagaland became a state and Manipur remained a union territory for almost a decade.
The siege
this,
mentality.
This was a grave mistake.
With the valley surrounded by hills, further added on to that. That is where, when he tells about the Lushai Hills, Lushai Hills again is contiguous with the forested area and the hilly region of that place. So it adds on to that. But
And the demand for union territory, or let's say autonomy, this has been a tool for conflict resolution. Look at the Modi government itself, working out a peace accord with the Bodos. And they made a lot of concessions.
NSCN as well.
Yes. Yeah. And anyways, that is still going on. That is still going on. But with regard to third Bodo Accord, the concessions that were made was something which was unprecedented.
Well, add one more angle into this whole discussion, which is that if the Meitei community was doing economically better, and if there was no employment angle, which brings in the concept of reservation, would this conflict have not been there itself?
I don't
It would
think
have manifested in a different form.
Or at a later point of time.
And also more than jobs, land has been a
But
bigger
land
issue.
is controlled by the Meiteis only, and it is the hill land which they basically, the contagious
Land is predominantly in the hills.
Yes.
and that is protected by the law itself that the Meiteis can take it.
Yes.
However, but that land is forested. So it is either forest resources or
So you don't
timber.
have to industrialize that area.
Yes, they don't want large industries. They just want access to their own ancestral land. That has been a problem.
No, also you can understand why Meiteis have that sense of insecurity because Meiteis cannot go to the hills and buy
Yes,
land, whereas
they cannot.
Nagas and Kukis can come down to the valley and buy
and
land.
they can buy land.
And don't forget, there are Meitei villages in Churchandpur and Ukrul and other Chandel districts. So,
Churchandpur in particular,
yes, there are Meitei villages and they can't own land there.
Yes.
Whereas Kukis and Nagas can come down to the valley, start a business, buy land. So that is a
The insecurity factor is so high. That is where I will come to a question. We talk about that High Court judgment had a different intention, it was interpreted differently, etc., etc. So shouldn't the judiciary also be extra sensitive when it is dealing with these issues which can be interpreted in n different ways and create social divide?
It's a twin-edged sword. Should courts just interpret the law without worrying about who is affected by this law or benefited? You have to be impartial in the way you give judgments without worrying about what the society will think about it. Who is going to be impacted more by this? You can't be playing the role of a politician to please one community and not antagonize the other community. You have to apply law and see what the law is. Yes, Manipur High Court went against judicial discipline. A law which is set out by the Supreme Court becomes the law of the land under Article 141. You can't tinker with that. And that's the problem that...
But I just have a different take on this. Because the High Court passed this judgment after a delay of 1 decade by the state government. I think in 2013, the union government had taken up this issue, asked the state for recommendations. There was a committee by the Tribal Affairs Ministry as well, which was in support of the SC status. The state government inordinately delayed this, which pushed the court to intervene.
But then there again goes the quotation that justice need not only be done, it should be seen to be done. So that is where I feel that the aspect of perception, that what the court order is, what its implication is, that needed to be communicated better by the judgment itself. The judgment could have been much more clear,
nuanced
in terms of what its implication is going to be. It is a directive to the state government and not a direct ruling that it is passing. So there, do you think that judiciary should also be held accountable?
Absolutely, I agree.
So, but is it more a political crisis than an ethnic crisis? Ethnic being, its origins being in ethnicity. However, now it's taken a proper political angle.
And there will be politics.
Now there will be exploitation.
Unfortunately, what is happening is brazen politics being played. And who are the victims?
The people.
The citizens.
Yes.
The innocent.
Who are our citizens.
True.
And that is why on this platform we represent the so-called mainland India. And I think it's time to apologize to the people of Northeast, particularly to Manipur, because we as a nation have failed to give you security.
Absolutely.
And with that thought, final conclusion from all of us, starting with you, Abhishek sir. History, you have beautifully explained the history of this conflict. Is there a lesson from the history as well to resolve this conflict?
If we look at the historical background of such conflicts, it is not a very good track record, because when ethnic violence starts, based on identity formation, it can spiral out. Therefore, first thing is trust building, which has to be done. And they have to understand their own history, because what they're doing right now is contesting the versions. And this is what I say in classes also, that the only use of history is to misuse history. This is where there are multiple narratives. Somebody has to establish a certain narrative which is acceptable to both. Maybe that may be the first step to bringing the conflict down. Because as much as there's a political angle, until unless there is proper understanding of who is a Kuki, who's a Meitei, and this new Kuki concept, and linking the Kuki identity with Bangladeshis and Myanmar population, this is where the historical angle to this has gone into a different, you can say.
So who will make the people understand? Or
this is where we need a more, you can say, a government-based maybe committee which establishes the right. Then that is itself problematic, because not every historian is unbiased. This is where the problem starts. Whenever you have, this is what after 1857, the British abandoned this model. Before 1857, the British used to use history to understand India. And it went really badly, 1857, revolt. And thereafter, they went into anthropology of India, which is called anthropometry of India. It's a colonial created mess, much like what we see in multiple parts of Northeast, or be it with China, the Tibet issue itself. And in that regard, it's a complicated issue. And I am not the right person to even establish the history of the Meiteis and the Kukis.
I think that's the theme of our discussion, that it is a complex issue.
It's a complex issue.
As they say, there is one past and many histories.
Yeah. That is the problematic aspect.
No, my only concern is with the peace, law and order, security. Let peace return to that state.
Yeah.
And if it can be restored by granting UT status to the Kuki-dominated areas, well, let it be. After all, it's a democracy, and democracy is the will of the people.
True.
If the will of the people is for a UT status with a legislature, do it.
And the beauty of the constitution and the beauty of the...
That's a slippery slope, because then that is one of the issues with Northeast is regionalism.
Yeah.
And the issue of Bodoland with the issue of
Regionalism leading to subnationalism,
Subnationalism,
eventually
and
leading to a kind of a...
Not necessarily. The beauty of the constitution is it is very flexible.
That is true.
The autonomy which has been given to various pockets in Northeast India has helped in subduing these
then
separatist
where do we stop?
tendencies.
And I don't think regionalism per se is a threat.
No.
Yeah.
Regionalism is if it is interest based, it's not a threat. It's only when you treat the outsiders, as you call it, from those coming from different parts of the country, and you block your state from outside influence, you are violating the preambular objective of fraternity.
Yes.
That should not happen.
True. Confidence building has to be done, the need of the hour.
Right.
And that is where, if the government is seen to be partisan to any of the group, the government needs to step down, or the chief minister needs to step down, or an action needs to be taken. Because otherwise, what we are seeing is the conflict spiraling out, and many other cracks opening up, which can have much graver kind of implication in the region as compared to simply the Kuki-Meitei conflict that we are seeing. We are already seeing on the ground, reports are coming in about this taking a religious turn as well. And that is a ticking bomb.
But silence is also not the answer.
Absolutely
here,
not.
Which has been the biggest issue from the central government.
And that is why we are speaking.
Yes.
So this is where I
silence
believe
is never
accountability has to be
Yes.
established at the state level, at the center. It took 1 month for the Home Minister to visit Manipur after the violence broke out.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister never went. There has been a lot of criticism against this. If Prime Minister could hold podcasts and meet influencers,
Yeah.
why don't you go to Manipur? Because a healing touch is necessary.
But then in conflict-prone zones, we don't have a history of prime ministerial visit in conflict zones.
But
So it
don't
has
in the
been-
parliamentary discussions, there could be more representation of Manipur. That is a
Absolutely,
very-
absolutely, yes.
think-
But then what I would argue here is that there has to be a kind of an all-party representation rather than the otherization of the debate which is there. All parties need to come together, and there have been grave mistakes on the ground with regards to
And
governance.
people of Manipur are watching you. So when you speak in the parliament, speak in one voice.
Yes.
At least on this matter,
Yes.
you should rise above partisan
Politics.
and speak in one voice. Speak to Manipur.
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't address the other part of the country. Don't try to cater to your vote bank. But
Let an all-party delegation go and visit Manipur.
Yes.
it has to be all-party delegation.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely, in agreement.
with no politics and a
Well, that is a kind of a wish that we can have.
And how I wish Manipur had 40 seats in the Lok Sabha. You won't see this
Yes,
Conflict,
true.
exactly.
It is about political representation. which
Yes.
is-
What was concerning was the government even tried preventing opposition leaders from entering the state.
That may also be required sometimes,
Yes,
because
sometimes.
you don't want to fish in the troubled waters
Yeah.
and try and instigate.
Many of the times the cracks open up much wider in
No,
the
in
case.
that case, the government leaders have to visit the state, be on the ground, deliver that healing touch.
but
This
again,
is where an all-party delegation
all-party delegation
might.
So
Yeah.
this is where
will help, led by the Honorable Home Minister.
Yes,
Do you think there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
It has to
it
happen.
has to be there.
But this is where I think the conflict is now going to the wrong zone of the
Yes,
communal
yes,
angle.
yes.
If there is a need, and if what there is a need for intervention, and this is the right moment, and I think we're having this discussion at the right moment, which is because if this goes into the communal angle, we have too much British baggage for using this communal angle and running away
And
with
can
it.
be exploited by forces which are
Yes,
not
yes.
very harmonious towards India.
And we
Look
There
at,
are
look at how European Union
Yeah.
passed statements on this crisis
Yes.
as if it was just a communal issue.
yes,
Yeah, that is. And even when you take a look at the various different NGOs and the groups, pressure groups in US,
Yeah.
they have been issuing statements left, right, and center as if, yes, it is a crisis, but it is not a black and white crisis. You need to understand.
I was
in depth.
going to say that the last thing we need is US talking about it.
But US has been
They
talking
have,
about
they
it.
have.
They have been.
My take is different. US talking, Europe talking, any other entity talking. If it can at least
Create pressure.
bring this government out from its slumber, I'm all for it.
But I feel that when you have multiple other forces or multiple other nations talking about it, if we take a look at history of our political background in our country, the governance, the governments tend to become much more aggressive in terms of the
Yeah.
stance that they take,
They will
rather
simply
than
shift the blame
Yeah.
to an outside
outside
hand, a foreign
force,
hand.
conspiracy theories
Yes,
start coming in that
start
point of
coming in
time.
that case.
So that is where, as of now, the best thing that can happen is all.
And do you think if the government would have acted on time, there was no need for international organizations to speak
Absolutely,
on this?
absolutely,
Absolutely.
in agreement to that. And already it has been around 19 months and
Yeah.
more. It is not an opportune time. It is already very, very late.
The best time was yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah.
The next best time is today.
And I always believe if state has the will, it
It
can
can do
stop
anything.
anything to maintain law
And
and
sir, there's
order.
a track record for micromanagement by this government. So this was where the micromanagement was needed. And this is where this, as I said, the silence of the...
That is what I say. Failure to assess the situation on the ground
True.
has been very appalling. So
And the worst part is we have so much experience with Northeast. The center has been dealing with this from 1947.
True.
And yet,
But
unforgivable mistakes were made.
experts were deployed, but it is very sad to see that even their feedback or whatever it is, that either was not incorporated or not implemented, or there was no learning, and we are staring at this grave crisis.
Sir, can I just then ask you one thing, that there's a ebb and flow to the history of the Northeast and insurgency there. And is this a tipping point where we go back to the 1950s, 60s?
I don't think
Hopefully
so.
not.
I don't
No,
think
no,
so.
I don't
Hopefully
think so.
not. But again, the destabilization in Bangladesh and Myanmar simultaneously
Simultaneous.
is a risk.
Yeah.
Because this is what happened decades ago.
Yeah.
When all these insurgents got a safe
So it's a
haven.
deja vu moment for
Yes.
some of
When
us.
Sheikh Hasina was there, this was not a concern. But it's far-fetched, but you never know.
That is where these cracks need to be healed as early,
As
possible without them being exploited.
Yeah.
Sir.
So that was it from our side on the real story of Manipur. Who is at fault? Is it the Kukis or the Meiteis? We are not here to judge. Our understanding of the conflict in Manipur comes from our reading of the literature, our reading of the journals, the newspapers, not the electronic media, but we may also not be fully aware of what is the real situation on ground in Manipur. If you're from Manipur, I urge you, I beseech you to please let us know what is your personal experience with this conflict and what do you need the government to do? What do you want and how do you want this conflict to come to an end? Please let us know in the comment section and thank you so much for watching this episode. All the best.